question for you. How many of you went on a first date at Bellevue Theater? Okay. I had a feeling that was a thing. Actually, somebody said to me, you know that's a thing, don't you? That was actually where I went to see my first movie. And that's pretty rare because I lived in Bergen County, but I came all the way down here for whatever reason to see my very first movie. And I may date myself, but that was The Sound of Music that I saw here. Yep. So I'd like to welcome you all here tonight, and very pleased to see you all here. I hope it doesn't get too hot in here. If it does, somebody tell me, and I'll turn the heat down a little bit. And I hope everybody gets seats. I'm not going to spend much time talking about this. I'm going to allow Helen Fallon, who's a member of our board of directors, to introduce Lisanne Renner, who's our speaker tonight.
Hi. I'm really delighted to introduce my friend and occasional research partner, Lisanne Renner. She's a journalist and the historian for Friends of Anderson Park. She and I collaborate on the walking tour of the Upper Montclair Business District, which, by the way, we'll be doing this spring. I think it's Saturday, May 5th, and the best way to stay tuned to those kinds of events is to like the Facebook page of the Montclair History Center or Friends of Anderson Park, if you're not already, if you haven't already, or if you're not on our mailing list. Right. But this building, the Bellevue Theater, really captured Lisanne's heart many years ago, well before it has recently been in the news. And in her style, she has uncovered lots of really interesting history and pictures and facts about it. And so there's no one better to tell us all about it than Lisanne Renner.
Hi, thank you all for coming on this snowy night. I think we're all here tonight because in November, the Bellevue Movie Theater closed, just 5 years shy of its 100th anniversary. And that feels like a loss because I think we're all here because we love it. In its 9 decades, it's been a major influence in town and on many levels and in many areas. One of them is architecturally. It helped solidify the Tudor revival style in the Upper Montclair Business District. And economically, it's been a magnet for Upper Montclair. People come to see the movies, and then they go out to a restaurant to go get ice cream. So it's been helps vitalize the economy of Upper Montclair. Historically, its construction in 1922 was part of a decade-long improvement of Upper Montclair's business district, during which the vernacular wood frame buildings were replaced by architect-designed masonry buildings. So there was sort of an upscaling of uptown. And culturally, it's for the earliest patrons, it introduced a new form of entertainment, of course, the movie theater. And it's also reflected changes that we've experienced in the nation, locally for us, over these 9 decades. It's found itself in the crosshairs of battles over race relations and also over battles regarding indecency. And in 9 decades, it's earned the status of a beloved institution here. It's been a place of escape and of entertainment. As Jane mentioned, it's a catalyst for romance. It's been an introduction to places far and wide for people, children and adults. And it's a place where audiences can just sit in the dark and have a communal laugh or a muffled cry. And so it means a lot to a lot of people, and people have told me that when they were children, it was their first chance to walk to the movie theater alone by themselves without their parents and see a movie, and it felt like a rite of passage to them. So it's been in the developmental process for a lot of people who grew up in town. So we're going to talk about all of that tonight, and we're also going to discuss possible future scenarios for the theater. There's nothing firm about its future yet. But first, let's just go way back in time before the theater even existed. So this is Bellevue Avenue in around 1901. On the right-hand side of the picture is where the future Bellevue Theater will be. What you see in this picture is roughly where the Bellevue Plaza parking lot is now. So I just want to give you a sense of how primitive Upper Montclair was two decades before the Bellevue Theater came to exist. You've got your dirt roads, and notice how all the buildings are wood framed. There are no masonry buildings. These are Annie and Charles Anderson. The Anderson family owned all the property on the south side of Bellevue Avenue between Upper Mountain Avenue and Valley Road. And they did quite a lot of development in Upper Montclair and really shaped the architectural look of Upper Montclair, as I'll show you as we go along here. This picture was taken in 1887, and that's either North Mountain Avenue or Watchung Avenue that they have their horses on. This is the Trunk Building, which is the building that predated the Bellevue movie theater. So this building was on the same site of where the Bellevue now stands. And it was called the Trunk Building because of its shape. And it had retail and offices on the ground floor. And then on the second floor, I believe there were apartments. And the top floor, which has that really interesting rounded roof, was a civic space. Churches would rent it and so forth. And this was built by the Anderson family. So this was one of the first structures that they developed in Upper Montclair. This is just another look to give you a sense of that's the Trunk Building on the left, and across the street is roughly where the parking lot is now. The next thing that the Andersons did was Anderson Park. They donated the land in 1903, and the park opened in 1905. And then they built this building, which we know as the Learning Express building now. Back then, it was the Fox's dry goods store, and it was also had apartments upstairs, and it was considered the first apartment building in Upper Montclair. And then in the 1930s, it was converted downstairs for a bank. So that's why it looks different to us today. And then the next building they built was this post office in 1918, this Tudor-style building that now is Coldwell Banker, Java Love, and the Olive That store are all there now. And then finally, they built the Bellevue Movie Theater in 1922. The Bellevue was designed by John H. Phillips, known as Jack. He was a New York City architect. We don't know why he was selected by the Andersons. We haven't been able to find anything out about that. So this is the oldest known photograph of the Bellevue. If you look over here, you can see what appears to be construction debris. So this was probably taken right after completion. And as I mentioned earlier, the Bellevue was really part of an upgrading of Uptown. And this picture shows some of the other buildings that were built within the decade that the theater was built. On the left is the Bellevue Branch Library, which opened in 1914. And on the bottom right is the bank building that opened in 1914. So starting around 1914, there was a lot of development of nice masonry architect design buildings in town. And this Bellevue Theater was really sort of the capstone of the Tudor style in the village of Upper Montclair. Tudor revival was very popular at the time that the Bellevue was built, and also at the time that a lot of Montclair was being developed. And so while there was a building boom going on in town, it coincided with the popularity of the Tudor revival style. And the Bellevue Movie Theater really helped reinforce that as a dominant style in Upper Montclair and sort of emphasize the feeling of an English village in this part of town. The very first examples of this Tudor style to come to Upper Montclair are not the bank building, but when the bank building in the middle of the photo was built, attached to it were these two Tudor-style buildings. So these appeared in 1914, and they were really the first examples of commercial Tudor buildings in Upper Montclair. And this building, which I showed you earlier in an older photo from 1918, was designed. It's now on the National Register of Historic Places, and it was built, again, as I mentioned earlier, by the Andersons. And that was sort of the second example of the Tudor style in Montclair. This whole strip that we're all familiar with on Valley Road was built between 1914 and 1923. And I would put a little asterisk there to say that one of those buildings was redesigned, I think in the 2000s, to fit in with the Tudor style. And then I just want to make it clear that the Tudor style was a craze in the United States between around 1895, 1945, but it has its roots and went back to the Elizabethan era. And I love this particular building from London in 1585. I just had to throw that in. And then the developer, or the architect of the Bellevue, one of the things that he mentioned when he talked about how he envisioned the Bellevue movie theater is that he wanted it to look like a house. Not necessarily a small house, but he wanted it to evoke a domestic feeling in it. And so I just wanted to show a few houses, Tudor houses, that have some of the elements that the movie theater has. I mean, this one, these are both the ones I'm going to show you on South Mountain Avenue. This one has the twin gables that the Bellevue has. And this one has the really elaborate half timbering that you see in a more simplistic sense on the Bellevue Theater building. And so one of the words that the architect used to describe what he wanted to evoke with the Bellevue was a picturesque old English tavern. He very specifically did not want the sort of glitzy, bright light, razzle-dazzle that you often associate with movie theaters, especially on their exteriors. He was going for a more subdued feel. This particular picture is from 1924, and the movie being shown is The Shooting of Dan McGrew. Another description he gave of how he wanted the building to come across is, as I mentioned, as a house, a domestic look, but an Elizabethan manor house. So he was going for that sort of thing. It's a very subdued for a movie theater, and it fits in with the scale of the streetscape. You would really, if you just see it from the sidewalk or street level, you really wouldn't have much of an inkling that there's a 1,000-seat movie theater behind those doors. When the movie theater opened in 1922, one journalist described it as looking like the baronial hall of an ancient castle. And indeed, from the outside, it looks like maybe an old English tavern or a manor house. Inside, it did maybe look like a place where you'd have dinner with a king in the 1500s. It had tapestries hanging on the walls, which you can sort of see them in this sketch. There was oak wainscoting along the walls. There were wrought iron chandeliers, and the beams on the ceiling were made of steel, but they were made to look as if they were oak beams. And when you're in the movie theater, or if you were able to go in the movie theater these days, if you went up to the balcony area, you can still see remnants of these beams right up there. That's like about the only thing that I can see that's left of the original interior. Now, the Bellevue went from one big screen to a triplex in 1983. And then in 1997, it became a quad as part of almost $1 million renovation. I just want to point out some of the characteristics of the Tudor style that you see here. Leaded windows, which most of them still exist, and the barge boards, which are these things here. Then on the left-hand picture, there's a finial at the top of the gable. That finial's not there anymore, but it was there until just a few years ago. I'd be curious to know what happened to it. It also, many Tudor buildings will have a corbelled chimney with terracotta chimney pots, which this has. And it has a very steep slate roof, and the slate is got an optical illusion going on. The pieces of slate, slate shingles at the very top of the ridge are smaller, and as you go down toward the bottom of the eaves, the pieces of slate get bigger, and that creates an illusion of a steeper pitch than you really have. And steep pitches are, again, a characteristic of Tudor style. That's a very daring man up there, I guess, repairing the roof. And then the half timbering, which I mentioned earlier, in the old Elizabethan buildings in the 1500s, the timbers were truly reflective of the structure of the building. They were really showing you how the building was built. And in the cases of the Tudor Revival, they're really just decorative, but they're nice. When I was a kid, I always thought of them as ice cream sandwiches. This is a floor plan for the building. It shows each picture shows a different level. But to me, what really strikes you is how vast and enormous the auditorium portion is in relationship to sort of this small piece that we see on the street. And now I'm going to just walk you through the building as it would have looked in 1922. So right here, we're it's as if we've just walked in off the street. And if we walk forward toward those two doors, that would take us into the building. But before we do that, I just want to point out that on either side of the entrance are entrances to other businesses. So the building was designed to have commercial that was unrelated to the movie theater on either side. And one of the reasons for that is that the developers wanted to hedge their bets. I mean, this was 1922. Movie theaters were still pretty new. We don't know yet if this is going to be something that flies or sinks. And so if you develop something so that you have other forms of income, if the movie theater doesn't really succeed, you're kind of hedging your bets a bit. The other thing I want to mention about this photo, which you can't tell just by looking at it, but above the doorway there's a quote from Hamlet. And this is the quote. It's a quote that's very popular among in the theater world, particularly directors and actors. And what I think is interesting about this is that you have a movie theater, which is a new technology. It's film, it's cinema, but in many, many ways it keeps harking back to the old theater stage architecture and sentiments and decor, and we'll see that more as we keep going. This, when I was mentioning that this is a beloved quote, it also appears above the stage of a theater at Boston University, which was built just 1 year after the Bellevue was built. And again, I just want to emphasize that there's definitely a connection here between stage architecture and design and cinema. So after we've walked through those doors that the quote was over, we come into the lounge here, which you've got your beams, you've got your wrought iron chandeliers. To the right, you have the stairway that would go up to the balcony seating. The door right in the center of the photo is the men's lounge, either the men's or the women's lounge, which I assume means bathroom or smoking lounge. And then to proceed onward to the theater itself, you would go through these doors right here, which were leather-clad doors. So those doors, the leather-clad doors, take you to this sort of passageway, which is called the foyer. The doors that you just walk through are here, and the entrance to the auditorium is here. So now we're in the theater. The curtain has a design on it, which is a little, I guess you can see that in this photo. And there's also a design over the valance across the proscenium arch. And there's an orchestra pit. This, again, gives you a sense of what it would be like to be in that space. You can see the tapestry on the wall, and below the tapestry is the oak wainscoting. This is the organ screen. There was a Austin organ, and on either side of the stage there were these screens, which I think were essentially where the sound would come out. The organ, I think, was somewhere else, but the sound came out through those screens. And I remember that these were silent movies, so they were accompanied by organs and at some points orchestras, but there were no talkies for a certain length of time, and I have not been able to determine yet what the first talkie was there. The interior design that we've just been getting a look at, the tapestries, the furnishings, the designs on the curtains and everything were all the work of this man, Livingston Platt. The interesting thing about him, again, is he came from the world of the theater, stage theater. He was the set designer for 27 Broadway productions. So he had a lot of stage cred, and that was what he brought to the Bellevue Theater. And this is just an advertisement for the company that did the curtains and the drapes and the upholstery for the Bellevue Theater. And then this man, Edmund, I think it's pronounced Lyle, he was really the big deal that was touted in all the advertisements. He was like the top guy in all the promotions. And what's interesting to me is he does not come from the artistic side of things. You know, he doesn't come from the world of sort of the drama of movies. He came from the tech world. He was an inventor. He had invented a kind of movie projector, and that was his forte. And that was, I guess, considered what was something that was really of high priority and needed to be done right. And he just gets top billing in the gala program and all the newspaper ads and everything. He's the top dog. Just want to give you a quick view on how the canopy and the marquees changed over the years. Originally, there was no marquee, and that's probably because the architect, did not want that sort of glitzy razzle-dazzle. That would be my guess. But very soon, by 1924, there is a marquee, because I think it would be very hard to advertise what movies you have if you don't have a marquee. Then I don't know when this particular marquee left the scene, but by the 1950s and up until 1997, this was the marquee. This is a side view and a front view of it. And it got hit by either a bus or a truck at one point because, you know, it projected pretty far out. And then this was put there in 1997 during the nearly $1 million renovation that I mentioned earlier. And this was on the last night. Then above the movie theater, there was a coffee house called Highgate Hall. And you can see in this cross-section, it's right here. So it's got a high ceiling with beams, and it had a fireplace. And there is still now office space up there, but I don't think it has those details remaining. But the Highgate Hall, an exterior view with the sign right here says Highgate Hall. And this is 1943. These ladies are meeting in Highgate Hall to discuss war bonds. And Highgate Hall was, like on Sunday evening, you could get a pretty nice meal there, pretty fancy. And in the mornings, you could grab something on your way to the train station. One of the things that was famous for was having these changing murals on the walls. The woman who ran the restaurant was named Flora Cutler, and she ran it with her daughter, and she changed these murals up several times a year. Excuse me?
Where, like, what part of the theater? You showed a photo where you said the sign was there. Just on that photo, could you show where that was? I'm just trying to picture. So this is the very front of the theater. This is like Bellevue is right here. I see.
And there's a stairs that you can climb at the theater now that take you up here. So
Left
it's this space right here. So just to give you an idea of what the menu at the Highgate Hall included, this was one particular Sunday evening's offerings: lobster thermidor, sirloin tips, stuffed turkey with cranberry sauce, grilled imported ham, roast young ducklings. So if you were a vegetarian, you were out of luck. Now, as you know, it's right across the street from the train station, so commuters would grab breakfast there, too, at Highgate Hall. This woman, Marguerite Hury, was a waitress at Highgate Hall in the early 30s, and she just tells a story about how guys would come in, because they were guys back then, to catch their trains. And they'd say, hey, I've got like 3 minutes to catch my train. I'll have the 4-minute egg. And the waitresses thought that was really funny. So let's talk about John Henry Phillips. This particular picture, this is an architect's rendering, and from his studio. I've seen 3 variations of this, but here's what's interesting about it. If you look at it for a minute, there's the theater. There is a covered passageway, like a bridge, connecting it to what was then the post office, is now Coldwell Banker Java Love, which is really interesting to me because that makes no sense with what we have now. Because what we have now is a building in between those 2 buildings. So my guess is, and this is it's a mystery I've not been able to pin down, but possibly the original thinking was not to tear down the trunk building and have the theater in between the post office and the trunk building. And then maybe for some reason they did decide to tear down the trunk building, or maybe the trunk building burned down. I have not been able to figure that out. Or maybe they just changed their mind, or maybe there was a property dispute or whatever. But for some reason that never happened. And so we have what we have now. Now, this is Mr. Phillips, like about 20 years after the Bellevue was designed. It's the only photo we could find of him. He was born in Wisconsin, and he studied civil engineering at the University of Wisconsin. And then he moved to Chicago, and he worked under Louis Sullivan for a little while. But the most formative thing, I think, for him was in 1903, which was early in his career. He got a fellowship to study in Europe, and he was in Europe for over a year, traveling around studying architecture there, and he really, really fell in love with Italy. And a lot of the architecture he did when he came back to the United States is influenced by historic Italian architecture. So that made a big impression on him. After that fellowship, he moved to New York City and worked for some architectural firms there, and then ultimately opened his own studio. Before he designed the Bellevue Theater, some of the things that he designed were private homes in an Italian villa style. He designed a Masonic hall in Tuckahoe, New York, a fairy tale cottage in the woods for a Whitney family member's estate, some elements for a park in Babylon, New York, and he did actually a lot of stuff in Long Island. Clubhouses for golf courses, clubhouses for yacht clubs. He was also a contributing editor to Architectural Review magazine and wrote a lot about historic interiors. So when he was hired to do the Bellevue, he was not a big name, but he wasn't obscure either. And as I said, we don't know why he was chosen by the Anderson family to do the Bellevue. Now, what I find interesting is 1 year after he designed the Bellevue movie theater, he designed this movie theater in Long Island, which obviously looks nothing like the Bellevue. But one thing that it has in common, and he writes about how he did this intentionally, was on either side of the entrance, again, you have commercial space, and upstairs you had office space. And again, this was to bring in income to supplement the movie theater, and as I mentioned earlier, to sort of be a hedge your bets.
There's also a very residential look to that building.
Yeah, and I don't know the context of that building. I don't know what was next to it at the time.
Wasn't the same theme used at the Claridge? I mean, if you look at the Claridge, it's open with, it had a restaurant in the basement, and it has...
Well, yes. And the Wellmont as well. I'm going to talk about that briefly in a few minutes, but you're absolutely right. That was not just done with movie theaters at the Bellevue. It was done in many, many movie theaters because it was just a way to bring in more income and also to sort of, as I say, hedge your bets if the whole, this movie thing goes belly up. This is the interior of the Babylon cinema. Again, very different than the Bellevue. This is what it looks like today, folks. There was a fire there which destroyed a lot of it. Interestingly enough, the Bowtie Cinemas, which closed the Bellevue Theater, also closed this theater a few years ago. Some people in the community are trying to turn this into a performing arts center now. Greatest achievement of Mr. Phillips was this building here, which is the Ringling Art Museum in Sarasota. It's a beautiful building. It was built by the circus magnate John Ringling, who had a winter circus school in Sarasota, Florida, and he went around Europe collecting treasures, and he needed a place to put his treasures. So, just a few years after Phillips designed the Bellevue movie theater, he was hired by John Ringling to design this building. And I think this was also probably the building that was closest to the architect's heart because he got to go wild with the Italian stuff. This is the courtyard, and it's just dotted with these sculptures. Which also would have reflected Philip's love of Renaissance Italy. The whole thing is like a Florentine palace. That's the courtyard again. The little girl in the blue jumper is me. Now I just want to sort of talk about movies in general in Montclair back in the day. Movie theaters were banned in Montclair until 1912, and they were considered sort of an unsavory element. They were sort of, blue-collar entertainment, working class. They were just not what Montclair wanted. But there was a lot of pressure to get a movie theater in town. Somebody right after the township voted to allow movie theaters, someone had applied for a license because you needed to apply for a license and be approved to open your movie theater. So someone applied for a license in 1912 and were rejected. And the Unitarian Church decided they were going to show some movies. They weren't going to be a movie theater, but they were going to show some movies. And so, they did. And most of these movies are like 6 and 9 minutes long. One of them, though, is this longish, probably boring documentary on the cocoa industry. But so this was kind of the first sort of entertainment the first taste of the movies that people could have. Then there was also the Montclair Theater, which was built in 1913, and it was on the southeast corner of Bloomfield Avenue and Valley Road. It was torn down, I think, in the 50s, and there's been a parking lot there ever since. But this was built not as a movie theater, but as a vaudeville theater. It also offered plays and concerts and lectures, but it did show movies on occasion, too. As early as 1916, there was a plan to build a movie theater in Upper Montclair on Valley Road between Bellevue Avenue and Lorraine. I don't know what happened to that, but I'm assuming they did not get a license. Then roughly the same block, a few years later in 1921, there was another proposal to build a 2,000-seat theater in Upper Montclair on Valley Road between Bellevue and Lorraine, and that would have been designed by Thomas Lamb, who was one of the foremost theater designers of that era, and presumably that did also not get a license. They were really tight-fisted about giving out movie theater licenses in the township. So another movie theater to come in was the Claridge. Now, every movie theater in Montclair that we have today, the Bellevue, the Claridge, and the Wellmont, they all opened in 1922. There was a big boom in movie theater development. In 1915, you had Birth of a Nation, which really set the stage for movies.
Do you know the date of 1922 when the Claridge opened?
I don't have that off the top of my head.
Before the Bellevue or after?
I've been trying to figure that out. I was afraid someone would ask that question. I think, but I have not nailed this down yet, that the Bellevue was the last of the three to open, but I'm not positive, so don't hold me to that.
It seems the Wellmont might have been the first, and the Wellmont even looked old when it was showing theater.
Yeah,
Movies and
that's true.
You said they all showed Birth of a Nation?
No, I'm going to actually talk about Birth of the Nation later. They did not all show it, but I'm going to get to that later. There was in 1921 there was a frenzy of applications for licenses for movie theaters in Montclair. There were 5 licenses submitted within the first 5 months of the year. And if they had all been granted licenses, there would have been a seating capacity of about 8,000, which was about 20% of the Montclair population. So there was some dirty politics that went on. These licenses were very competitive. And this is the Hink building, as you know. The Claridge is in the Hink building. Hink was mayor at the time. He wanted to make sure he was going to get his license, and he didn't want competitors in the same area getting licenses. So he was, I think at one point he said, I'm not going to vote on these others, but there was some sort of shenanigans where somebody who was in the central business district who applied for a license did not get one, and he did. And then, of course, the Wellmont got a license. And then I believe the Bellevue Theater was just considered so far away, it wasn't considered real competition. So you have the Claridge. This is the interior of the Claridge. This is the Wellmont. And, as I mentioned, it was a building boom for theaters in Montclair, but it was also a building boom for theaters nationwide. And the Claridge and the Wellmont are the 2 bigger theaters in terms of seating capacity. And then you had the Bellevue, which opened on May 13th, 1922. It was a big gala celebration. Over 1,000 people attended. The mayor came and accepted the theater on behalf of the town. It was a big hoo-ha. There was like this is just part of a multi-page insert in the Montclair Times touting the amazing Bellevue Theater. There was also a 4-page gala program that people were given. Now, the developers of the Bellevue were the Anderson family. So there was Charles Anderson, who was the father of this guy on the far left. Charles Anderson, by the time the Bellevue opened, he was 74 years old, and he was getting ready to pack up and move to California. He was an insurance executive, and so was his son, Robert, who was probably the primary engine behind the development of the Bellevue Theater. As well as being an insurance executive in New York City, though, he was also very much a developer of real estate in Montclair and managed the properties that the family had built earlier. Yeah, his father donated the land for Anderson Park. This is Robert Anderson's home. You may recognize it. It's at the western terminus of Bellevue Avenue. And his family has told me stories about how, sometimes stars would attend the premieres of movies, and then after the premiere, they would go to a party at the Anderson home.
Are they still there?
No, they sold it a long time ago. Yes. The Andersons have been very involved in the town for a long time. So this is 2 pages of that 4-page gala program I mentioned. They named everybody who did any little thing related to the development of the theater, even the sidewalk contractors. So they were very, very proud. The first film to open on that gala night was D.W. Griffith's Orphans of the Storm, which was about the French Revolution. It starred Lillian and Dorothy Gish. And, my fantasy would be to have that movie shown in the Bellevue Theater in 2022. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but... Just would like to talk about sort of the Bellevue's role in society and role in the lives of people who lived in Montclair and grew up in Montclair. For one thing, it was, as all movie theaters were very famously, it was a diversion from the Depression in the 30s. Was a woman named Nancy Adams who wrote a memoir about growing up in Upper Montclair in the 1930s during the Depression. And she talks about how kids would throng to the Bellevue to see Flash Gordon Gordon serials and those kind of movies. And she herself was infatuated with the photo plays and the silver screen magazines. So, the movie theaters were very much a presence in the lives of kids and adults. Generations, a few decades after her generation, recall going to movies as a major event. I mean, you could reserve seats at the Bellevue Theater the same way you could at a movie theater. I mean, at a stage theater. The ushers wore bright yellow blazers. Movies like Mary Poppins in 1964, Sound of Music in 65, Fiddler on the Roof in 71. They shone across a great big wide screen, and they showed for a long time. They weren't showing for just a week or so. And the Star Spangled Banner was played before each showing. As one resident recalled, it exuded class. I want to also talk about movies and morals. As I mentioned earlier, Montclair didn't want movie theaters to begin with. They were sort of nefarious, odious things, but the people wanted them. But even decades later, they came under a lot of scrutiny. So in 1962, my French isn't good, so I'm going to do this in English. Dangerous Liaisons, the French version, was going to come to town, and there was huge controversy over this, scandalous. And the police seized the print from the Bellevue movie theater. The town proposed a censorship law to prohibit any future indecent films. Then in 1973, there were intense protests over Last Tango in Paris at the Bellevue. And there was picketing, letters to the editor, and heated town council meetings. And I think at one point, it was shut down, and then they were ultimately allowed to show it. I mean, there was all sorts of legal issues that would make it hard to really prevent them from doing this. But it was just scandalous.
I remember because I was in high school then, and it couldn't be shown before 8 o'clock at night. And there was a group, not Montclair, NIM they were called, and they were the ones that were always out in front with the signs.
Yeah. This is an article about the segregation at the Claridge Movie Theater, which was in 1928. The NAACP went to the town council complaining about this. There were one particular woman, I mean, this happened all the time, but one particular woman decided to complain. And so in this article, it says that there was not segregation going on at the Wellmont and the Bellevue. I'm not so sure about that, but that's what the article says. Excuse me?
Yes, it was.
I had a feeling there was.
All through my growing-up years.
Good. Well, I'd like to hear about this because I'm trying to document what was going on at the Bellevue. It's been hard to document. This kind of segregation was going on definitely in the 30s and the 40s in theaters in Montclair. The NAACP and the Unitarian Church in particular were instrumental in trying to fight that and protest that. And then I think it was you who asked about Birth of a Nation. There was a lot of uproar when Birth of a Nation was going to be shown in Montclair, first at the Claridge, and I'm not sure what the outcome was with the Claridge, but then, and bear in mind, The Birth of a Nation came out in 1915, but then again in the 1920s they were showing it, and it was considered a very odious movie. I mean, forget about issues of technical filmmaking and stuff, but in terms of the content, it really, a lot of people attribute the rise of the KKK to the showing of Birth of a Nation around the country. So there was a lot of outroar when people tried to show it at Claridge, and then later in either the late 1920s or the early 30s, showing it at the Bellevue. And when there was plans to show it at the Bellevue, the NAACP and about 100 people protested that, and ultimately it was not shown. So, the movie theaters have played, a lot of touch points with American history have roped in with the movie theaters.
The segregation went on through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s in the theaters, and it wasn't until the 1960s when people began to rise up, because at that time, Plessy versus Ferguson was good law.
Right.
And you could do it. and it was legal.
Right.
Get away with it.
I think it's interesting that that article was in the Pittsburgh Courier about the Montclair movie.
Yeah. So the future. As we know, the Bellevue closed in November when the tenant, which was Bowtie Cinemas, opted not to renew the lease. It kind of went out with a whimper in the sense that the last movie was a bad mom's Christmas. The contract that they had with the owner allowed them to rip out all the fixtures. So they ripped out all the seats, the projectors, the screens, other fixtures, which makes it very financially challenging for someone else to come in and start up another movie theater. By doing this, Bowtie effectively eliminated a competitor in town. They run the Claridge.
I read that the person who actually owns the building was trying to weasel his way through and say that he was going to buy back, like, the, I guess, projectors and everything, but Bowties were like, it's our, it's our.
Right. Well, my understanding was that the owner of the building offered to pay money to Bowtie to have them leave all those things intact, and Bowtie opted not to do that. And their lease allowed them not to do that. I mean, they were doing what their lease allowed.
This is just a personal observation, but I think the reason Bowtie had 2 theaters in this town in the first place was because I noticed it every time I saw what was playing in either theater. The Claridge would always have these big, important Hollywood films and also European movies, where the Bellevue always tended to show popcorn movies, blockbusters.
Exactly. Yeah, and I don't know much about running the movie business, so they may have had, perfectly logical reasons for doing that. But yeah, I noticed that too. Now,
Is there any scuttlebutt as to what Plan B is, what at all?
as I go along, I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the ideas are. First thing I want to mention, I know people have said to me, oh my God, they're going to tear it down and turn it into a parking lot. I doubt it. It's in a historic district. It's in a town historic district. It says proposed, but that's because it's an old report. But this is the historic district. The Bellevue Movie Theater is within this district. So any alteration to the exterior of the building would have to go through the Historic Preservation Commission for approval. And it is a key building in the district. So that is the highest level of importance among the buildings in the district. So it's a prized building, not just by people that love the movie, but by the township has to protect it. I mean, I think there are elements in the preservation rules that would let you demolish a building if you had some severe financial hardship, maybe. I'm not an expert on that, but I think that happening is a very slim likelihood. But it doesn't have to be a movie theater forever. So, right. Right, the historic district does not protect the interior of the building, and really there's nothing historic left of the interior anyway. So as I mentioned, it's a key building in the historic district, and I just want to point out how little the building has changed over the years on the exterior. On the interior, it's a whole different ballgame, but on the exterior, aside from the marquee and some minor details, the biggest change is on the first floor. On the right-hand photo in the far right, you'll see that the little store here, it was a newsstand when I moved to town in 1995. That's been blocked off in 1997 when the movie theater wanted to expand its concession area. So that was a pretty substantial change. And, the hair salon here, this has changed a little bit. But you can tell it's the same building, and there's still a lot of historic integrity left there.
Question on the marquee. To go back to the slide for Last Haggle in Paris. Shouldn't that have been the marquee with the big B on it as opposed to?
Well, you're seeing it from the side. And it looks very different from the side than it does from the front. It's kind of like the grill of a car. So it's the same sign, it's just from a different vantage point. So just want to talk about some of the realities that movie theaters are facing now. It's a very different industry than it was 20 years ago. You've got Netflix, Hulu, and other streaming services which have hurt theater attendance. Domestic ticket sales declined 2.3% from 2016 to 2017, which is a 22-year low. And attendance was flat at North American cinemas in 2016. So, it's not like it used to be. The biggest money, I think, is in multiplexes and in IMAX theaters. So they're not with little theaters like the Bellevue.
I mean, isn't that sort of a little bit like a cop-out of an excuse? Netflix and Hulu and other streaming services, unless you're going to find Foot Locker or other illegal sites, those services don't have blockbuster films the second that they come out. They have them 7 to 8 months later, or they have
Doesn't
a smaller
matter,
version.
people will stay home and watch what they can and get their entertainment.
Yeah, that's
But
true,
that,
but
but that
let's face it.
excuse has, I mean, if you go through the decades, you'll see how when cable TV happened, there was a
Oh, yeah.
daily ticket sale.
But we also need to be making better films.
100%.
If you want to watch
But-
Justice
All right. We can talk later. I need to get going here. So I want to talk, people have asked about sort of what are the scenarios for the future. I would love to see it remain a movie theater, and I know the owner very much would love it to remain either a movie theater or some sort of performing arts venue or some sort of building that still includes movies in its program. Excuse me? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Oh, his first name is Jesse, and his last Sayag. Thank you. I wasn't.
Florida, I believe, right?
He lives in Florida, but he also, I think, he used to live around here, and he does business all around the world. So he's here. He's been up here dealing with this. It's not like, I wouldn't describe him as an absentee landlord. He's very involved and hands-on. He has a personal love of movies. He worked in a movie theater when he was a kid. He's owned this building for more than 20 years, and he really does care what happens to the building and what goes on inside the building. But he also faces a new reality that was not the same economic reality as when he bought the building over 20 years ago. So I think I mentioned this earlier, it would cost $500,000 thereabouts to put back the movie theaters, the screens, the seats that were taken out. So that's a large hurdle for anyone who wants to make that function exactly as it did before.
And the other issue is to make it ADA compliable. Now the rules are different than they were the last time it was renovated.
I want to give you some ideas of what have been done with other similar size movie theaters. This is just a kind of spot check. But this is a movie theater in Winter Park, Florida. It's an Art Deco, so it's a 1930s. It became a pottery barn. This is an interesting hybrid. This is Ann Arbor, Michigan. It used to be a large movie theater. Now it's Urban Outfitters on the ground floor, and on the upstairs, it's a movie theater. The movie theater is run by another movie theater in town, so it's programmed by this other movie theater. So it's a hybrid of retail and movie. This is a place in Newton Theater in Newton, New Jersey, which turned their closed movie theater into the Skylands Performing Arts Center, where they show movies and they have live music and they also have art classes. So it's sort of a hybrid of things there too. And I think some of the possibilities for the Bellevue would include not just a movie theater, but movie and other uses in the space that was now fully a movie theater. So rather than 4 screens, maybe there would be 2 screens and office or retail or something like that. But nothing is solid at all. The owner has been talking with local groups, who have business plans that they're trying to demonstrate the feasibility of, and also groups from outside or individuals from outside Montclair. So there are a lot of ideas that are being pitched. He wants to really make sure that whatever goes in there is sustainable. He doesn't want someone that's going to go in and go belly up in a year. So he's being highly selective about what direction he goes in and who he lets in the building. I wanted to just end with this Vincent Tango illustration of the Bellevue, because I think once something is a Vincent Tango illustration, it's an institution. It's basically declares that something is a Montclair institution and that there's a lot of love for it. And then in terms of just keeping in touch and finding out what's going on with the theater, I suggest you join the Save Montclair's Historic Bellevue Facebook page and read the newspaper and read Baristanet and keep on top of the news. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisanne. That was amazing.